You're listening to the Future Tech Health Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Until I reached age 40, I never realized the obvious, that we all have medical issues, or we at least have a family member or close relation that had, has, or will have them in the future. Medicine and biological systems are the final frontier. Until we've conquered death, figured out how life began, cured cancer, and understood our purpose in the universe, there's a heck of a lot to talk about when it comes to our health. Future Tech Health means I'll be covering futuristic topics that are actually already in clinical trials, or even starting to appear on shelves or by prescription, or available for your own use. We dive deep into stem cells, CRISPR-Cas9, the science of sleep, epigenetics, medical testing, cancer, ketogenic diets, stem cells, aging, regenerative medicine, and more. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a serious medical problem. Remember, however, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and share it with friends. Thank you.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Future Tech Health Podcast, and I have Günther Witzany. He's a philosopher specialized in the philosophy of science, philosophy of language, communication, philosophy of biology. In the late 1980s, he proposed the concept of life as a communicative structure. Cells, tissues, organs, and organisms organize and communicate through processes and sign-mediated interactions. And so we're going to talk about that, biology and evolution and all those good things. So, Günther, thank you for being here.
Fine.
Yeah. So tell me about what are you interested in the world of biology and evolution, and why? What made you interested in this for so long?
Yes, my expertise is philosophy of language, originally, and then I read in the 90s of the last century, I read a lot of biological papers, and so they use many terms out of language science or linguistics, such as cell-cell communication or with a genetic code, transcription, translation, and so on. And then I investigated how they found and justify their terms, and I had to notice that in biology they use these terms in a rather outdated version. They use communication and language in a mechanistic way, convinced that you can explain language and communication by mechanistic terms. This is not correct. This is clearly an error, because philosophy of science had a 60 years old discussion, and this discussion has a result. And the result is you can't catch communication or language in a mechanistic way. It is impossible to catch these terms mechanistically, because in language you have superficial grammar, for example, but also a deep grammar, and with mechanistic approaches you can catch the superficial grammar, but not the deep grammar.
Well, with language, there's also intonation, and then there's there's a whole bunch of things. You can allude to something. Language, I guess, is very sophisticated and has many levels of communication, right?
Yes, in every communication you need some sign system to transport what you want to utter or to say. And it is clearly the result of this discussion that you have three levels in every kind of language. And this is the grammar, how to combine the single signs to a longer sequence, of, like in our sentence or talk now. You need the correct grammar, otherwise we stand each other. So Then we have to transport something, some content, which means this is semantics, the meaning of the signs we use. Prominent level of rules in language is pragmatics. This was forgotten by most biological disciplines if they speak about natural language or code, because pragmatics means that there must be a sign user or a sign using agent which is interwoven in a concrete life world, and the context in which this sign user is involved decides about the meaning, not the semantics, not the grammar. So in biology, always, if you have a natural code, like the genetic code, for instance, it was long the conviction, if you have the grammar of the nucleotide sequence, you have the meaning.
Okay.
But this is an error. It needs the context in which the sign sequence is used, which decides its meaning. So we can see this at epigenetics. We have the same and identical DNA code for some gene or gene regulation, but the methylation or histone modifications, the epigenetic markings, decides how DNA is transcribed and translated into proteins. So you have the possibility that you have an identical code, but depending on the context, it is a different translation into proteins. So you have the same code, but you may have a variety of different proteins as a result out of this. It depends on the context. This was completely forgotten.
So epigenetics changes the context in which the DNA, well, epigenetics is affected by our environment, which is the context in which we live, and that affects how DNA is read and transcribed. Is that what you're saying?
Correct.
Okay, got it. And then a big question that comes to mind is, does language require intelligence? Coding, decoding, creation of a code. What are your beliefs there?
Yes, with my studies and my expertise in the early 90s, it was clear that the assumptions of biology, that genetic code is the result of error, replication, and natural selection of a variety of errors, is not correct, because there is no natural language and there is no natural code which speaks itself or code itself. There are always, in all empirical investigations we know, there are competent sign users which speak a language or which code a code. So the assumption that there is a natural code like genetic code is the result of errors, and the selection of a variety of errors cannot be correct. So I searched for agents which are able to edit this code, to arrange nucleotide sequences, who change nucleotide sequences in living organisms, and as a result for evolutionary novelties and genomic variations. I searched nearly 20 years for this, but I did not find my agents. And then 2005, I read a book from avant-garde virologist Luis Villarreal from Irvine University, California. And this book was Viruses and the Evolution of Life. And he, in very detailed way, explains how viruses determine cellular life in all stages of its life. And so I was very excited because now I found my agents which edit code. And as Villarreal proved, the main life motive for life of viruses is not disease causing or the bad disease agents which damage whole societies through disease, but the most prominent and most actual motive of viruses to live is to infect organisms and to install themselves in the genetic code of the host organism, and he called it, this is persistence. They persist in the organism. So we have, for example, in human genetic code, nearly 20,000 persistent viruses,
really,
which are constantly integrated. Not most of them cannot be replicated because they are only parts of the former viruses, infection agents, but parts of viruses now are adapted and now serve as regulatory tools for the host to regulate his gene expression, his replication, his immune system. Most prominently, the most immune systems also of prokaryotes and eukaryotes are from former viral infections that now got persistent status, and so help cellular organisms to defend themselves against invading parasites and have possibilities to change their genome actively if adaptation processes are necessary. So this was
That's
really
amazing.
exciting.
So viruses, you can see them wearing a shirt with the crown on it that says "Keep calm and infect on." You know,
these are only those that are not able to persistently invade a host organism.
So you're saying the whole purpose of viruses is to integrate with the DNA of other organisms so they can continue?
Yes, this is the main purpose of viruses. It's an infectious genetic parasite, and the most prominent motive of viruses to infect and to install themselves into the host organism. In most cases, it's not one virus, but viral clouds. If you take one drop of seawater, you have 1 million bacteria, but 10 times more viruses. So if we go swimming in the sea, we are swimming in a soup of viruses. They don't harm us. They don't do anything to us because we have a strong immune system. But some integrate and help to strengthen the immune system, and also competing viral clouds try to integrate in host organisms. And then the exciting thing occurs, the competing viral clouds who want to infect the host organism are somehow counterbalanced by the immune system, and this counterbalance invading parasites, genetic parasites, now can integrate into the host organism as counter-regulation systems. If they are integrated as counter-regulating persistent viruses, we have very much regulations in our genome as any other living organism. And normally the counter-regulation functions very well. But if you have some disease or some infect, or you have a bad cold or so, or even in cancer, this counter-regulation can get out of control, and one side now is too strong and not counter-regulated by the other side. And so most of the diseases we know are out of control counter-regulations in this sense.
So what are some examples of viruses that have integrated into our genetics as humans, and what functions do they serve?
Yes, for instance, we have a lot of retroviruses integrated in our cells, and one of the most prominent is for sure is the syncytin gene, which cares that the trophoblast, this is the embryo of in mammals. If the trophoblast cell has a membrane, and this membrane is regulated by this syncytin gene, which derived from retroviral infections. And this syncytin gene cares that the embryo is not identified by the immune system of the mother as foreign. So if the syncytin gene is read and replicated, the embryo is sure not to be recognized by the immune system of the mother. And as long as the syncytin gain is replicated, the embryo is carefully protected. And after the embryo is old enough, then the replication of the syncytin gain is stopped, and but this doesn't matter because the immune system of the mother is now suppressed, and the embryo can grow up. So this is one example, the syncytin gain. But there are a lot of other things like the ARC gene, RC, ARC gene, which cares for synapse communication and the cognitive capabilities of brain mammals with big brains, like our relatives, great chimpanzees or so. And this ARC gene is responsible for cognitive capabilities. So if this is correctly transcribed and translated, the ARC gene, which also derives from a retroviral infection, then the cognitive capabilities can grow and develop.
Okay, interesting.
Another example we now can look at is like the HIV virus.
HIV?
HIV virus, which is very dangerous now and kills many people, still kills many people. But some few people are immune against this. And we have indicators that in these few people, this REV virus is integrated persistently, and if they reproduce, nobody will become ill. But if they reproduce with non-infected, with people which have doesn't have this protection, then this disease can become virulent and dangerous again. So the population of humans which have this virus integrated won't become a disease, but if they mix with non-integrated members, then the disease will go ahead.
So viruses want to change their hosts and insert their DNA, and then they also want to protect against other viruses getting in there and disrupting what they've done. Yes. So going back to an earlier question, and I'll broaden it, do you believe that a mind or intelligence is required to create a code? And do you believe that all creatures that are alive have some sense of purpose or self, even a virus?
I don't think that we must need some terms like mind or conscious which edit this code, because also the virus depend on RNA networks, and RNA networks, the communication of RNA networks serves that viruses can constitute, and together with viruses, RNA networks are integrated into cellular organisms. And these three levels, RNA networks, viruses, and cellular organisms, have different communication levels, but they are complementary. So if we look at life as we know it here in our planet, we have these three levels of communication, RNA networks, viruses, and cellular organisms, which depend on each other. So they clearly can edit genetic code, RNA networks in every cellular process, in cells, tissues, organs, and organisms. The key replication or transcription, translation, epigenetic markings, immune systems, even repair systems depend on these RNAs. So the new perspective is to look at DNA just as a house, and the RNAs are the inhabitants. They are active. DNA is not active. DNA is a rather stable information storage, evolutionary archive. But what are the agents that live out of this archive for the host? It's the RNAs. the RNAs in every process of cellular life plays key roles.
So how do you think life began?
Yes, life began, and this is the concept Luis Villarreal and myself, we wrote some articles about this. Life is constituted and it started with, this is very interesting, they started as a genetic code in the RNA world. There was some investigations some years ago, and they found if you have a RNA stem loop, the stem is a double-stranded RNA and the loop is a single-stranded RNA. If you have one RNA stem loop, this functions only in a physical chemical way. It reacts only in a physical chemical way, constantly following natural laws. But if you have a group of such RNA stem loops, then, interestingly, biological selection starts. So, life, in my perspective, started with group interactions, group communication of RNA stem loops, because then biological selection starts, and this is not possible on abiotic planets, that biological selection starts. This is only with these couples, and the density of RNA stem loops. And then they could build groups, and they had no stable information storage, but constantly changed in a very dense way. The oceans were full of these RNAs. And then is the question, what starts then? Viruses or cells? There's a discussion and a discourse and the competing concepts, whether viruses came first or cells came first. But it is clear that most viruses serve or have genetic sequences which cannot be found in cellular life. So this is an indicator that viruses are older than cellular life. Personally, I think that viruses and cellular life may be started together, but the roots of viruses clearly relate to the old RNA world, and therefore is older than cellular life, even if viruses and cells emerged in parallel.
So what do you think that life is an emergent property of naturally forming RNA that came together in groups?
Yes, for sure. Because if you have the single RNA stem loop, it reacts only in a physical chemical way. But if you have a group of RNA stem loops, then biological selection starts, and the genetic code, which is absent on abiotic planets, starts to work in their interaction modus. They constantly interact with their loops because they are single-stranded and are binding prone to meet other loops and can build groups that represent a kind of early genetic identity, and this identity is able to differentiate between self and non-self. Integrate, if one RNA stem loop group meets another RNA stem loop, it may identify, does this fit to us? Can we integrate it or not? Do we reject it? And so self and non-self differentiation, which is clearly a property also of viruses, and later on of cellular organisms, starts here with the genetic identity of such groups. And not to forget, RNA stem loops constantly invade other RNA stem loops. So if one group is weak, it is occupied and manipulated immediately by one. And the remaining single parts, which are rejected in later times and under changing circumstances, may fit in a later phase and may be in a later time integrated into self or rejected, former integrated ones. So this is very dynamic, and this very dynamic life of RNAs was not on the focus on former pictures of life.
Are there any lab experiments where people have taken various RNA and put it together in a dish and see if the RNAs interact and start to change over time? Has that been observed?
Yes, there are a lot of papers, and Villarreal and myself, in our articles, we took this in our references and also in the meetings I organized in 2008, natural genetic engineering and natural genome editing, or 2014 was DNA habitats and their RNA inhabitants, and last year we had evolution, genetic novelty, genomic variations by RNA networks and viruses. This was the third congress. The proceedings are published at the New York Academy of Sciences in the Annals.
So people have taken RNA, put it in a dish or a culture or a medium, and they've seen it interact with other RNA and changed it?
Yes.
What kind of interactions did they see, and how long did it take for interactions to happen?
There are, in very detailed work, many groups did research on this, and they identified even how the tRNAs, which in the ribosome care for translation of the messenger RNA into the amino acids, they found that the tRNAs derived from two different parts from former, which were invented or emerged for different purposes, not for translation into amino acids. But when they got this final form of a tRNA, transfer RNA, then they were able to bind in this exciting process with their triplet code, the amino acid code, and to produce proteins. So these researchers in RNAs, most prominently by Thomas Cech, who got the Nobel Prize for this RNA world hypothesis, and now hundreds and thousands of groups which do only research how RNAs communicate and interact with each other and what properties they have. There is no mind and no consciousness, but there is their competence to bind to other RNAs and produce biological selection processes.
So RNA, you said there is no consciousness, there is no mind in RNA.
No.
What about in a virus? What about in a bacteria? What about in a invertebrate? At what point does it start?
So if you, there is no consciousness, no, but there is still life. And life depends on, is it able to communicate together, to coordinate? So one of my main purposes or premises of my books is that living nature as a whole is organized and coordinated by communication processes. So if you look at any cellular process in cellular organisms, there must be coordination and organization between organs, between tissues, within the tissues, within the cells, within the organisms. And these are all communication processes clearly identified as such. And if these communication processes function, then the organism, the tissue, or the organ has no problem and functions as it is necessary for the whole organism. But if these communication processes are disturbed by something outside of the organism or inside the organism, then the communication comes out of control, and if communication disturbance occurs, then disease may be the result. So this is life.
Well, but why do we have consciousness then? Why do we need consciousness if life can work without it?
We are a single event in life with our conscious, but we have consciousness is a difficult term. Consciousness is we can find also in primates. They have a language that is not the same like ours, and they are not self-reflective, but they can still communicate in a very differentiated way. Also the cetaceans, the dolphins, the whales, and also some birds have strong cognitive abilities, different to humans, but without no doubt on a high level, depending on social communication processes. So we can go down now to bacteria. Bacteria in groups can also have very differentiated communication processes, so they form communities like the biofilm. You know the biofilm. Right. If you have a cold in the nose, you know the biofilm. And if you take the human oral hole, there are 500 different kinds of bacteria, and they have all to communicate with each other to get a constant equilibrium in the mouth hole. Otherwise, we get a mouth disease on the mouth hole. So if there is some organization and some coordination in living nature, you need a communication process which functions. If the communication doesn't function, you can't coordinate common goals, for instance.
Right. But you don't think that a mind created RNA or DNA? You just think it emerged out of non-life?
I don't know this, but a mind is not necessary to explain how RNAs, viruses, or cells live. They can't do it by themselves. They are competent to use science and communication processes. That's enough. Communication processes have an inherent feature they want to function. Communication process want to be successful, and otherwise you can't coordinate common goals or common behaviors, like in bacteria or in single-cell eukaryotes or in fungi or in plants. The difference between animals and plants is that the communication in plants is not so slow because it's not electrical. It's only on chemical ways. But they have properties which is more than in animals. Plants can communicate on 5 different levels in parallel. It's impossible for animals. They have a central nervous system. They have the brain organ. The brain organ says what the organism has to do. In plants, they have a decentralized communication processes and therefore can be able to communicate on different levels in parallel. So this is for a sessile organism necessary because he can't run away. But if a plant mentions a dog running around him, if the plant could think, she would wonder what is doing this dog here. He's running away. So
it's eating my leaves. It's peeing on me. So what is the latest thing that you are working on? What new topic is fascinating you, and what are you working on?
Now I got a contract with my publishing house, and I will edit then as next of my book. The last in the series is biocommunication of fakes. Biocommunication of fakes. These are the fakes are the viruses that only infect bacteria, and half of the bacteria of the world die through fake infection every day. The reason why bacteria still are alive because they are very fast in reproduction. So also the fake therapy is an important step which will last the next decades because the multi-resistant disease-causing bacteria now, as a result of multiple use of antibiotics, now causes these multi-resistant microbes. And fake therapy, which only kill bacteria, is now the leading field to catch these multi-resistant microbes and to help humans to avoid dangerous times in this.
Do phages eat bacteria and viruses, or just bacteria?
Phages are viruses.
Oh, okay.
Specialized viruses. And they only catch bacteria. They are specialized on bacteria, so they are they also co-evolve with bacteria. So bacteria try to escape fake infections by changing their immune systems, and especially the CRISPR-Cas system, which is now under investigation, is a result of how bacteria integrate former infection events of fakes into their genome that to update their immune system to faster react against invasions.
So do phages do the same thing with bacteria as they do with us? Do they try to infect bacteria so that their RNA will be incorporated into the bacteria? Do they have the same goals as regular viruses?
Yes, the viruses is an effective agent. In the first place, is an effective agent. But as I told before, most want to use cellular life genomes as natural habitat to invade and to persist, and not to reproduce, because host serves for reproduction, and the persistent status will also be reproduced. The perfect way of life for viruses.
I thought that some viruses will infect a cell and force the cell to make many copies of it, and then they will kill the cell and then infect other cells.
Yes, these are the dangerous viruses. These viruses were not able to integrate persistently, but try to replicate via disease-causing infection, and the cell dissolves, and the viruses spread within the organism and maybe kill the organism or cause a dangerous disease. But these are the rare exceptions, not the general life form of viruses. This was a strong error in biology in the last decades, to think that viruses are the bad guys.
And same thing with bacteria. Not nearly all bacteria are bad.
Yes, bacteria. So we now have this discussion about the microbiome in the gut. In our gut, we have these bacteria which are most prominent symbionts of higher cellular life forms, especially mammals and animals, and we can only digest what we eat and metabolize if the microbiome in our gut is well balanced and well at the whole, then we feel well. So if the gut and the microbiome gets out of control in our gut, everybody of us knows what the consequences are.
Well, very good. Well, Günther, thank you for coming. And if people want to learn more, how can they get in touch with you or read your books or papers?
So this is all on my website. This is biocommunication.at.
Okay, biocommunication.at.
Yes, AT, Alpha Theatre.
Oh, okay, AT. Sorry, AT.
That's
like Apple Tree.
There are all my books, and there is an introduction in my philosophy of biology, and there are nearly all articles for download, and this is a good information basis.
Well, very good. Günther, thank you for coming. And
thank you too.
I think
interesting talk.
Yeah, definitely.
You're listening to the Future Tech Health Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Until I reached age 40, I never realized the obvious, that we all have medical issues, or we at least have a family member or close relation that has, or will have them in the future. Medicine and biological systems are the final frontier. Until we've conquered death, figured out how life began, cured cancer, and understood our purpose in the universe, there's a heck of a lot to talk about when it comes to our health. Future Tech Health means I'll be covering futuristic topics that are actually already in clinical trials, or even starting to appear on shelves or by prescription, or available for your own use. We dive deep into stem cells, CRISPR-Cas9, the science of sleep, epigenetics, medical testing, cancer, ketogenic diets, stem cells, aging, regenerative medicine, and more. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a serious medical problem. Remember, however, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you enjoy the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and share it with friends. Thank you.